Hi, my name is Alex Singer, and on behalf of the Huawei Heterogeneous Compiler Lab and my team, I will be presenting SYCLops, a SYCL-specific LLVM to MLIR converter for the IWOCL and SYCLcon 2022 conference. In today's presentation, I'll be going over some background on LLVM, MLIR, and OneAPI's SYCL implementation. I will then give an overview of the SYCLops converter, including its design principles and its design. I will then show some of our experimental results from evaluating our implementation, followed by an explanation of the future work. Some background on LLVM. LLVM is a compiler framework for taking source files written in some supported programming languages and lowering them to an object file to be executed on hardware. LLVM compilers are generally composed of three stages. The first stage is the front end, which is used for parsing the incoming file and translating it into LLVM-IR, which is LLVM's intermediate representation that it will use when optimizing and lowering for a given target. The second stage is the mid-end, which will take the LLVM-IR emitted from the front end and optimize it for a given hardware. And the final stage is the back end, which will take the LLVM-IR emitted from the mid-end and lower it to binary for execution on the hardware. The SYCLops converter uses LLVM as its input, or LLVM-IR as its input, so this is why I go over the background here. Multi-level intermediate representation, or MLIR, is a relatively new framework built off the LLVM project that was designed to be able to mix multiple different levels of abstraction within a single source file. This allows for higher level optimizations within the LLVM compiler framework, simplifying many complex optimizations. The multi-level in MLIR is referring to the multiple dialects available within. Three main dialects of interest to SYCLops are the following. The affine dialect, which provides affine analysis, control flow, and operations, and is very useful for optimizations such as tiling, data copy generation, automatic vectorization, and much more. The SCF dialect, which is MLIR's static control dialect, is used by SYCLops if the control flow is non-affine, and the arithmetic dialect, which contains all of the basic arithmetic operations such as addition, subtraction, multiplication, etc. MLIR also provides types within its dialects to represent complicated data types and structures. These include the memref type, which is MLIR's way of representing arrays instead of using pointers, and the index type, which is a special integer type whose bit width depends on the hardware being targeted. The index type is mainly used for induction variables and indexing into memrefs. SYCL is a C++ abstraction layer for heterogeneous applications that handles the host and device programming within a single source file. OneAPI is an implementation of SYCL that lowers SYCL source files to a fat binary and is based on the LLVM infrastructure. It compiles the host and device through two separate compilers, which are later linked and loaded into a single executable. The device front-end compiler emits LLVM-IR to the device compiler, which is subsequently lowered to an object file that will be executed on the device. The problem we see here is that the device front-end compiler emits LLVM-IR. LLVM-IR was built to optimize for CPUs. However, this often leaves the device code suboptimal. We believe that MLIR is capable of generating more performant code for accelerator targets and would like a way of lowering to MLIR in the device side of the compiler. This is where SYCLops comes in. SYCLops is a converter capable of taking LLVM-IR code generated by OneAPI's device front-end compiler and converting it into MLIR. This would allow the device compiler to make use of the many high-level optimizations found in MLIR before optimizing in LLVM. The MLIR code can then be lowered back to LLVM and lowered as normal for the device. Notice this performs minimal changes to the current implementation of OneAPI's SYCL. Now, a question you may have about SYCLops is, why a converter? Why convert LLVM-IR to MLIR instead of just having the device front-end compiler directly emit MLIR? There are four main reasons we choose. Firstly, MLIR is a relatively new framework as compared to LLVM. LLVM IR has had many years to mature and can represent much more than what MLIR currently can. The second reason is simplicity. OneAPI's device front-end compiler is already set up and tested to emit correct LLVM. By performing very simple optimizations to clean up the IR, it's relatively easy to map the LLVM IR to MLIR's higher level dialects like the affine dialect. Another reason is that many other projects are trying to do exactly this, emit MLIR from a C++ source file. However, these implementations are not production ready yet, and they are trying to generate MLIR from general C++ source files, not SYCL specifically. And finally, SYCLops was scoped to be limited to the device side of the SYCL source files only, as opposed to device and host. This greatly simplified the work necessary to emit MLIR code, as we can ignore certain patterns that would never show up in the SYCL device kernel. The SYCLops converter was built with four main design principles in mind: extensibility, program structure preservation, block and control flow graph separation, and appropriate error handling. In order to accommodate for other projects, SYCLops was designed to be extensible. SYCLops is constructed from two types of modules: a base module to handle the interpretation of the SYCL constructs and control flow being passed into it, and backend specific submodules to work with the base module to translate the LLVM IR into the target IR. For example, as well as targeting MLIR, SYCLops could be used to generate hybrid script that can be used to target AKG, which is based on TVM. As shown in the image on the right, the LLVM IR is handled by the base module. The information it collects is then handed off to the submodules to be converted into the target IR. This allows for other backends to be supported naturally with SYCLops. The main purpose of SYCLops is to convert, not optimize. That is, the program structure of the incoming LLVM IR should be preserved in the output IR. It'd be more efficient to generate suboptimal code in the target IR and then write passes within the compiler to optimize it for a given hardware. This would allow the compiler to have more control over the optimizations that occur in the kernel and would greatly simplify the SYCLops converter. Thus, SYCLops will generate code as close to the incoming LLVM IR as possible. Assuming the target IR is of a higher level of abstraction as compared to LLVM IR, the control flow of the incoming IR will likely be completely different. For example, LLVM IR does not have dedicated instructions for for loops or if statements, whereas MLIR does. Other instructions, such as arithmetic and memory instructions, however, are likely to be very, very similar. Thus, the control flow instructions found in the LLVM IR would need to be handled completely different as compared to what we call block instructions, which are the arithmetic, memory loads, etc. So SYCLops will split the conversion of these two instructions into two stages: block generation and control flow graph reconstruction, which I will go over later in the presentation. And finally, appropriate error handling. Error handling is a pretty standard programming practice. However, SYCLops follows particularly strict error handling, since all device code would be flowing through it, and thus it is unacceptable for SYCLops to emit invalid code. It must convert the incoming code correctly or crash trying. An example would be if the incoming LLVM IR cannot be expressed in MLIR. Let's just say there's no way. SYCLops should crash, emitting an error to the user detailing why it crashed. The point of this design principle is to simplify the debugging and maintenance of the SYCLops converter, ensuring stability and longevity. So now I'll move on to the actual design of the SYCLops converter. SYCLops is split into 5 stages: preprocessing, IR analysis, block generation, control flow graph reconstruction, and finalization. Using these 5 stages, SYCLops is able to convert SYCL LLVM IR into any target backend. But for this presentation, I'll be focusing on how SYCLops targets MLIR. The first stage is the preprocessing stage. Coming from the device front-end compiler, the incoming LLVM IR may not be in an expected form, which causes the analysis in the converter to be very complicated. To simplify the analysis and conversion, transformation passes are used on the input LLVM IR. There are 2 main transformation passes that are performed. Conversion simplification passes that are used to prepare the IR for instruction generation, and control flow simplification passes that are used to simplify the control flow of the incoming IR. These include things like loop simplify pass and the LCSSA pass, for example. After this stage of the converter, the LLVM IR will not be changed. All of the subsequent stages will be seeing the exact same LLVM IR. The next stage is IR analysis. The purpose of this stage is to extract 2 main pieces of information: the shape of the incoming SYCL argument pointers, and the control flow of the incoming IR. The shape information of pointers are stored into specialized shape class, which contains the rank, size of each dimension, element type, and address space of a pointer. Later in the conversion process, the shape information can be looked up and used to generate memref arguments. The LLVM loop analysis and dominator tree analysis passes are used to generate a control flow graph, or we call it CFG, of the incoming IR. The CFG will be used by SYCLops to reconstruct the control flow in the target IR. After the IR has been pre-processed and analyzed, we can move on to the actual IR generation. The block generation stage of the converter traverses the LLVM IR basic blocks, which are basically collections of instructions within LLVM IR, and converts non-control affine instructions into MLIR operations. These operations are stored into MLIR blocks that will be linked together later in the control flow graph reconstruction stage. So as you can see on the image on the right, the LLVM IR is split into, let's say, 2 basic blocks. We would expect 2 MLIR blocks as output. To generate the control flow operations, while iterating over the basic blocks that represent a loop latch or an if header block are collected and used to generate for and if operations after the block is generated. Unlike LLVM IR, MLIR contains specific operations for handling control flows. These operations will also be generated in the stage as well, and will be stored in a temporary block separate from the other blocks. This was done such that this will be the only stage that will generate MLIR kernel operations. The following stages simply move these operations into their final locations in the function. This will become more apparent in the next stage when all these blocks need to be merged into a single block so they fit into a function operation. So, all the operations have been generated. However, they are isolated into MLIR blocks with no branches connecting them. The control flow graph reconstruction stage is responsible for connecting the MLIR blocks and the control flow operations together in such a way that the control flow of the original LLVM IR function is reconstructed in MLIR. This is done by recursively traversing the CFG from the IR analysis and merging the MLIR blocks together, inserting the control flow operations where needed. By the end of this stage, all MLIR operations for this kernel should exist within one MLIR block, which we call the function body block. The last stage of the SYCLops converter is the finalization stage. The purpose of this stage is to take the function body block generated by the CFG reconstruction stage and insert it into an MLIR function op. Due to the fact that MLIR represents pointers differently to LLVM, and the fact that not all function arguments will be used, the arguments to this new MLIR function will not match the original LLVM function. This is a problem, since one API expects this function to have a specific prototype. which we are implicitly changing. The goal is that when the MLIR kernel is lowered back to LLVM, it'll be able to be properly called using the original function prototype. To get around this issue, SYCLops uses a trampoline function approach. The original contents of the LLVM function are removed and replaced with a function call to an external function. The prototype of this external function will match the prototype of the MLIR kernel as if it was to be lowered back to LLVM. After the MLIR kernel is lowered back to LLVM, it can be linked and inlined with the trampoline function to give an LLVM function that matches the prototype of the original LLVM function. At this point of the conversion process, the SYCLops converter has finished, and the MLIR kernel and the LLVM trampoline function will be emitted as outputs. So in summary, SYCLops works as follows. A SYCL source file is passed into one API's device front-end compiler, and an LLVM device kernel function is produced. The pre-processing and IR analysis stages are run on this LLVM IR file to clean up the IR and get the information necessary for conversion. The block generation stage then converts the contents of the LLVM basic blocks and the control flow operations into MLIR blocks. Then the CFG Reconstruction stage links these blocks together into one function body block. Finally, the finalization stage will wrap this into an MLIR funcop and generate the trampoline function for this kernel. So that is how SYCLops was designed. Let's look at how it performs. To demonstrate how SYCLops performs, we ran 3 experiments. A kernel scalability analysis, which was done to answer the question, does SYCLops perform as expected on a real MLIR compiler? Next, an MLIR optimization study, which was done to answer the question, how much improvement does MLIR optimization provide for a given kernel? And then a converter functionality demonstration, which answers the question, does SYCLops work on complicated and interesting machine learning kernels? All tests are run inside Huawei's SYCL compiler, performed on an Ascend 910 server. To evaluate whether SYCLops emits expected results in MLIR, experiments were performed on a 2D ReLU kernel of varying size. ReLU, also known as the rectifier, is a common activation function used within machine learning applications, which we felt best demonstrated the scalability of the SYCLops converter. As to be expected, as shape size increases, so does execution time, where 32-byte aligned memory, or no tails, is usually faster than non-32-byte aligned memory, or with tails. This is a consequence of the Ascend hardware's minimum DMA size. The dramatic increase in performance between shapes 68 by 2048 and 136 by 2048 is caused by a double buffering optimization being activated within the compiler. As shown from these experimental results, the MLIR code generated by SYCLops is performing exactly as expected on a real MLIR compiler. To evaluate the effectiveness of the MLIR optimizations, an MLIR sigmoid kernel was generated by SYCLops. Notice that this version of sigmoid has 2 loop nests. The first nest takes the negative exponential of the input and stores it into a temporary tensor. And the second takes the reciprocal of this temporary value, plus 1, which is a sigmoid. Since there are no data dependencies between these 2 loops, and the loops are identical, they can be fused using the affine loop fusion pass, which will save the temporary tensor from being stored into and loaded from, which would save a small amount of time. Also, since the data being accessed is continuous and operates element-wise on the input and output tensors, this kernel can also be fully vectorized using the affine supervectorized pass, which, on the Ascend 910 server, should provide significant speed improvements over leaving the code scalar. The speed of this kernel was tested with and without loop fusion, as well as with and without vectorization. And we noticed a 5% speed up from loop fusion, which is to be expected, and we noticed a 43 to 47% speed up from vectorization. This experiment demonstrates the performance benefits that can be achieved from entering into MLIR as opposed to only LLVM IR. And finally, to stress test this SYCLops converter, we demonstrate SYCLops converting a k-means kernel into MLIR. We consider this to be a stress test due to three difficult code patterns that appear in this kernel. Shown in green is conditional branching. What we notice is an if statement that the execution either takes or returns from the kernel. And as we can see, an affine if is generated on the right, with the proper affine set to represent the conditional. As shown in blue are iteration arguments and escaping scalars. Since MLIR does not contain nodes in its standard dialect, iteration arguments and escaping scalars are represented within the control flow operations. As shown on the code on the right, the affine for operations contain these iter args. And shown in red are imperfect loop nests. As shown, this for loop contains more than just a for loop. It also contains an if statement, which SYCLops handles without issue. From this experiment, we demonstrate that SYCLops is able to convert complicated device kernels without any issues. So that was an overview of the SYCLops converter and experiments performed on it. We will now discuss the future work left to be done. There are two main situations that SYCLops is unable to convert. First is complex control flow. Loops that cannot be expressed in canonicalized form, or kernels with exits that cannot be simplified into a single exit, cannot be converted by SYCLops yet. More work will need to be done to express these complex control flows in MLIR. Second are the built-in SYCL functions. SYCL has many built-in functions that cannot be expressed in MLIR yet. This is more of a limitation of MLIR and can be fixed by adding these functions to the MLIR dialects. These future work items are further explained within the paper. If you have any questions regarding the paper or this presentation, will be available on the Slack channel. Thank you very much for listening.